We are joined now, as we are every Wednesday on Ottawa Today, by Elliot Tepper, Carleton University political science professor. Good morning.
Good morning, Mark.
We often divide our stories into the Trump and the non-Trump, and we're going to do that again today, but yes. I think we should start with the situation in Afghanistan where this car bomb, a suicide bomb in the diplomatic area, which is widely considered to be the safest part of Kabul, killed 80 people or more.
Actually, we could broaden that out and talk about bombing, because bombing is transforming politics. While we watch the circus go by, basically, it's tempting to say Washington fiddles and the world is burning. Certainly it's being bombed. We have in Afghanistan, remember Canada has had a major commitment there. We are partners and NATO partners and Canadian troops on the ground there for a long time, setting up Camp Julian and a deep engagement with Afghanistan over a prolonged period. Afghanistan clearly is still in turmoil. No one even wants to claim responsibility. This was such a massacre that immediately after it happened, the Taliban said, hey, we didn't do it. And ISIS probably will claim responsibility, but it doesn't matter who did it in a sense. What it shows is that people are quite willing to massacre in large numbers for political ends the innocent. That's happened not only, as we know today, in Afghanistan, but just yesterday in Baghdad. There was an ice cream parlor specifically targeted, Muslims gathering for the breaking of the fast, so the children there. And, of course, that wasn't the only one in Baghdad. There were 2 or 3 other bombings. And we were just caught up with what was going on in Manchester. So the targeting of the innocent for political ends is one of the stories of the day. We don't have a good handle on it. What does it all mean? What it does all mean is that as the forces of disorder gain strength, then this kind of activity is likely to increase.
And that's about all we can say at this point, really, until we know more. But it's all part of the same storyline, right? It is. It's not really a new twist. It's shocking, but it's all part of the same story.
It's also it's part of today's message for me is it isn't all about Trump. This entire world of ours is not all gathered about what's happening in downtown Washington and the ongoing chaos in that administration and so forth. The world has politics of its own. America has had a leading responsibility that it chose to play, particularly after 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the sole hegemon of the world, the policeman of the world. And right now we have a leader in America that says, we don't want to do that anymore. And we've been talking about that, and we'll probably come back to it. But as we have a world which has the astonishing collapse of the Arab state system, the post-First World War system, Sykes-Picot and all that, now we have Raqqa coming under attack. So as the noose is tightening on ISIS, which in turn was a product of the collapse of that state system, which in turn was et cetera, et cetera. So we are seeing a weakening of the center and a rise of this kind of deliberate targeting of civilians as a byproduct.
All right, let's continue talking then about the non-Trump stories, and we'll get to Donald Trump coming up in a few minutes. What else have you been watching in the world, and what else should we be paying more attention to right now?
We should always be paying attention to Syria. That story continues. The ISIS continues to do its terrible things, the government and so forth. But one of the stories that did come since we last talked into the news happened in the Philippines, where there was an attempt to capture by the Philippine government, by the military and constabulary, one of the world's most notorious terrorists, the leader of Abu Sayyaf. They thought they had him. America has a $5 million bounty on his head. So this looked like it was going to be a success story. Finally, they had this fellow cornered. No, it was botched. He escaped, and he's joined with some other terrorist groups there. The Philippines has an overwhelmingly Catholic majority, but it has an overwhelmingly Muslim province in the south, Mindanao, which has been in insurrection for decades. But the major groups were all coming under control. That is, they were all coming to terms with the government, and the government was saying, okay, now maybe we'll even talk about federalism as a way out, a nice Canadian topic, but we should keep in mind that Abu Sayyaf was not ever part of that, and Abu Sayyaf has now declared itself to be part of ISIS. Actually, they were there before, and actually they're probably bandits doing kidnap for ransom. And we should remember in Ottawa that 2 Canadians were beheaded. They were captured, and this group, Abu Sayyaf, wanted to make a deal. No deal was reached, and I want to remember their names: Robert Hall and John Risdale, 2 Canadians who were murdered by Abu Sayyaf and whose deaths have not yet been avenged in any way. Now it's turned into an insurrection in the Philippines. These groups have swarmed out of where they were, and the Mindanao, we have to remember, is where President Rodrigo Duterte's home base is, 22 years as mayor of Davao. He, in turn, is now saying martial law. So a president who already was accused of not paying attention to the laws has suspended the constitutional protections of the Philippines, which were so hard won in any event because of earlier martial law episodes under Marcos. Now the Philippines is in crisis.
All right, let's turn to Donald Trump and some of the implications of what he's been up to in the last week. And we'll start with the most recent thing, and then maybe in a few minutes we can talk about his attack on Germany on Twitter and what Angela Merkel has said about Trump. Justin Trudeau has weighed into that a little bit. Lots to talk about. But this morning, about 2 hours ago, he tweeted, "I will be announcing my decision on the Paris Accord over the next few days. Make America great again," in capital letters. So
guess what that means.
Yeah, so, I don't think we need to wait for the decision to know what direction he's going.
Yes, the greatest success of the G7 was that he did not cancel there,
right,
while in Europe. What everybody was telling him not to do, don't get out of the Paris Accords. He said, okay, I won't get out of it here and now. I'm going to go home. But I'm listening. The key thing is, he said, I'm listening. I'm hearing voices. So I think what we're seeing now, and it's coming into sharper focus, is that Donald Trump is making a clear choice. We thought, because of what happened in Riyadh, that he was listening to the generals, sometimes called the adults in the cabinet. That is traditional voices of what America ought to do in the world were seeming to come into play. And he was at NATO. The NATO Secretary General was here in March or April, and again, a very traditional approach by Donald Trump. Okay, NATO's not obsolete. So what we, I think, are now seeing more and more clearly is that it's not going to be the generals and Rex Tillerson and Nikki Haley and the traditional Republican positions. This is going back to be a Trump-Bannon presidency. As the presidency is more and more in crisis and under attack, then he's falling back on the kind of Donald Trump that was the campaigner. Is this a win or a loss? Well, let's talk, since we haven't really finished off with his world reorganization tour, and we talked about it here in terms of Saudi Arabia and Israel. He talked about grand strategy, and we're going to make an alliance with the Sunni forces, and all this is against ISIS. Also, by the way, not against ISIS, hardly mentioned, but against Iran. Very clear positions, and we're going to solve the dispute there, and we talked about that. Is this really grand strategy, or is it really all about money? The Saudis said they're going to invest in America. They're going to buy billions of American armament. So all of that, and then he went off to see the Pope. He said, I'm listening. I've heard what you've said. And then he goes to the NATO, and he's fallen back on a traditional Trump-Bannon approach, pay up, or I'm... What was really striking to me, and this is where I think it's becoming clearer, Mark, Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, said on the way over, the reporters cornered him on this trip, saying, well, what about NATO and Article 5? An attack on one is an attack on all. He said, of course we support that. The President of the United States lectured NATO. He went to Riyadh and said, I'm not here to lecture you. He then lectured NATO and said, and he really did not support the traditional American position. So I think we're seeing more and more that the Bannon approach to dealing with crisis and the world, that worldview, seems to be coming more to the fore. And what you just mentioned is a key test of it, because what we read is that the reason there hasn't been an announcement yet on the Paris Accords is division in the White House.
Right.
The closest advisors. And who was on which side? Well, it turns out Ivanka and some of the other really close advisors to the president said, you can't back out of this, Dad. You don't do this. And who else was saying that? Remarkably, the boys from the oil patch, Rex Tillerson and Rick Perry, these really are the voices of big oil in the government today, also said, don't back out of the Paris Accords. Who said, let's back out? Bannon. So the Bannon worldview seems to be coming to the fore.
Even though if you go back 4 or 5 weeks, it was sort of like Steve Bannon's out of favor. Maybe he's going to quit. Maybe he's going to be fired. Right. Now there's been a resurgence.
You and I talked about this, and I said, don't believe it. I think he's still there.
Yeah.
He's just been told, don't get your picture on the cover of Time magazine anymore.
Right.
So, but he was. So who's coming to the fore? It seems to be that President of America. Was this trip overseas a success? If you take a look at the kinds of things we normally deal with, the President of the United States has not signed on to the security architecture or the economic architecture that has brought peace and prosperity to America, and that the generals and the traditional Republican point of view would support. What has been signed off on is that view, apparently, and the spat with Merkel represents it. And what we have instead is the coming to fore of a Bannon, let's make America great, and it's good for the base.
All right, we'll talk more about Donald Trump, including what Angela Merkel has said about Trump, what Trump has said in response, what Justin Trudeau has said when he waded into it. Elliot Tepper from Carleton University, our weekly chat about the world today, will continue after this. Elliot Tepper of Carleton University is with us every Wednesday on Ottawa Today, and Prime Minister Trudeau actually spoke yesterday about... Well, I don't want to say he spoke about this, but he spoke after the evidence arose of escalating tension between Germany and the United States following the G7 and NATO summits. And Trudeau said, leaders who think we can hide behind these changes, meaning technological changes, globalization, or turn back the clock are wrong. He talked about addressing climate change, welcoming refugees, and supporting free trade. Those are all things Donald Trump does not stand for. And by and large, Trudeau has tried to play nice with Donald Trump. Do you think this is starting to sound a bit different from that? Is he potentially, as some people have suggested, a possible broker between the United States and Europe?
The G8 became the G7 because the G7, the G8 is advanced industrial democracies. After Crimea and all that, Russia was out. Now it seems to be the G6 plus one. So it's all the rest of the industrialized world, and then there's the United States. One thing to keep in mind, he made that an address in Italy where he was warmly received. Italy was the host of the G7. The next host of the G7 is Canada, and the host sets the agenda. Italy had set the agenda just along the lines you mentioned. They wanted to focus on migration and on Africa. It didn't happen. And protectionism, unfortunately, was also supposed to be, fought against by the G7, and instead it was Donald Trump doing his thing. So Canada, as a host, gets to set the next agenda. Meanwhile, NAFTA...
Can't wait for the security bill on that one, by the way.
Well, that's guess who pays that security bill? Maybe we should start saying, this is transactional. You want to come here and you're a target? Well, maybe we should send you a bill. Anyway, that's what Trump is saying about Germany. So I think the sharpening... Canada's caught in between wanting to be on the right side of Donald Trump and at the same time standing up for its values, and the G7 is crystallizing the difficulties. The initial response to the Canadian government was a kind of mild one. We wanted a good summit kind of thing. Yes, at some point, push comes to shove, and that's happening now. And Trudeau is throwing in his lots with everybody else at the same time that NAFTA is officially under renegotiation. In fact, we just found out it's going to be August, not September, that this comes to the front burner for Canada. Can Canada be an interlocutor, an intermediary? That's always the hope. Europe everybody always looks to Canada saying, well, you live next to these people. Talk to us about them. How do you deal with them? And the Canada model for establishing good relations with the Trump team during the transition period, I think, was widely noted, and others would like to emulate it. So we did everything we could, and then NAFTA didn't get torn up, but it's going to be renegotiated anyway. We will have to see to what degree the government of Canada, under any leader, can walk that fine line between standing up for what Canada has stood for and what the government of the day has stood for, and still get along with the Donald Trump, who clearly, as of this week, is moving sharply in a different direction.
By the way, the next G7 summit, the one that'll be in Canada in 2018, Quebec, it'll be in La Malbaie in Quebec, which is a couple hundred kilometers east of Quebec City. So this is the pattern now, especially in North America, is to host them in fairly remote locations where it's easier to secure a perimeter and keep it safe rather than, say, in Toronto, where we had the G20 summit a few years ago that turned into...
in Italy, it was held specifically in an isolated place, but it was also held in a place that overlooked the Mediterranean because migration in Africa was supposed to be the centerpiece, and people are drowning. Remember, people are drowning in huge numbers in the Mediterranean, escaping the horrors in Africa and the Middle East. So, yes, Canada has a tricky role to play here. We'll have to see. I think pushing back on America seems to be what Trudeau is currently doing, but in a way that he hopes will not sour the possibility of continuing good relations.
Angela Merkel clearly was not happy with how things went at the summits, and then when she said something about that, Donald Trump tweeted about Germany, saying, we have a massive trade deficit with Germany, plus they pay far less in capital letters than they should on NATO and military. Very bad for U.S. This will change.
Yes, very bad. Very bad. Germany, very bad.
Yeah.
This is part of, I think, a very significant shift in what's happening in the world. You remember Merkel has spent NATO and then G7, plus she had that summit, which didn't go very well very early on. And what she said after all that is this: I can only say, says Angela Merkel, we Europeans really have to take our fates in our own hands. That must be done in a spirit of friendship with the United States and Britain, but we have to wage our own fight for our future as Europeans, for our fate. I think what's happening more broadly, if we can just take this to a high level, is that as the United States announces and demonstrates it no longer wants to be the regulator of world affairs, others are stepping forward into that vacuum.
Right.
China, in particular, is probably the biggest single winner, along with Russia, of this reorganization tour that Donald Trump just took his first major tour abroad, because Europe has clearly been weakened. NATO has been weakened. And in the South China Sea, China continues to do its thing. And with the withdrawal from the TPP, it's really a green light for China. China is stepping forward saying, we believe in globalization. We will be the leaders on the environment. So this is a changing world order, really helped along by the stance of the current president of the United States, who speaks for the country, saying we no longer stand with our traditional alliances and our traditional allies in a traditional way. Will this have a silver lining? That's what everybody's now, others are speculating. Well, this is good for Europe. If Germany now really does have to stand forth and be a bigger leader in the world, and if this forces the EU to finally come to terms with Brexit in a way that maybe this was a kick in the pants that they needed, so to speak, well, yes. But what this means is that we're going back to a world of states, not of multilateral organization. If the announcement out of Washington is this, it's every state for itself. And state after state, Canada included, will have to come to terms with that.
Elliot, thank you. We will see you next week.
Indeed.